Our next speaker is Kitty Courtney with Tetra Tech. Kitty and Tetra Tech are the ones that are preparing our sea level rise, vulnerability, and adaptation report. They're essentially, we have a team approach. It's essentially SOEST, Dr. Fletcher's team, Tiffany Anderson, Matt Barbie, Hanani, and they're doing the science, they're doing the modeling, and Tetra Tech is going to take the modeling and use it in their report with an innovative hazard assessment tool. So I want to say that I know that Kitty has 25 years experience in this field, and she has a PhD in oceanography. She's very learned in marine and coastal management and climate adaptation and community resilience. So with that, Kitty.
Good morning, everyone. So I was reflecting on the way in and realized that it would have been about 30 years ago, about this time of year, when I would have been just over at the Marine Science Building, banging away on the very first computer I ever owned, trying to finish my dissertation on the impacts of climate change on coral reefs and how they calcify. And I have to admit that at the time it was an academic question, but it's not academic, is it, anymore? And so it's with great pleasure that our Tetra Tech team is helping to provide support to the Interagency Climate Adaptation Committee. It's nice to be able to, after all the years I've worked internationally on these issues, it's nice to do something at home. So I just have two goals for this presentation. I want to give you a quick overview of Act 83, what did it do, and the progress that we've made to date, and to stimulate your thinking on sea level rise adaptation, not only for this afternoon, but beyond. So when this act passed in 2014, it basically said, climate change was going to profoundly impact our life, our way of life. It established an interagency climate adaptation committee whose mission is both long-term collaboration, but also an initial focus on sea level rise. And the main task before the committee and our job in supporting the state and working with Dr. Fletcher's group is to prepare the statewide sea level rise vulnerability and adaptation report by December 31st, 2017. I had an acronym in there. I hope Suzanne left. So it's not SLUR, it's sea level rise. One of the things that was launched in December was the Hawaii Climate Adaptation Portal, and I want to bring this to your attention. I think you all went there to register, but please keep that in your favorites. You will be able to find the schedule of meetings of the ICAC, key documents, resources, and we have a lot of great links. And Dan Dennison is here photographing and videotaping all this. These will be placed up on the website too, so you'll be able to tell friends of yours who were not able to hear these presentations to view them. So as we heard earlier, sea level rise will exacerbate a number of coastal hazards. Many of these as a state, we've been coping with for some time. And we're going to be looking at how to assess the risks of these hazards. Now, we've adopted a multi-track approach to develop what we're calling living outputs. And why are these living? First of all, we hope that through the work over the next 2 years that we'll be able to build a broader and more informed constituency of stakeholders. And this workshop right here is part of that activity. That the sea level rise report as part of Act 83 must be reviewed and updated every 5 years. So again, it's a living document. And then the modeling and GIS database that will come out of this work will be used by state and county agencies and communities and will be improved and updated as new research and new science come about. So the two tracks are really the stakeholder outreach and engagement, and a number of activities that we'll be doing to identify challenges and recommendations for adapting to sea level rise. The second major track is a risk assessment. Again, we'll be bringing in the hazard modeling that Dr. Fletcher spoke about and using that to understand vulnerabilities and impacts. Now, I'd like to talk about some of the initial outputs of the work, which we really just started last September. And one of these is Allison Andrews, who's on our team, has been leading, is the development of sea level rise adaptation stories. We know that all of you are doing many things and working already in this arena. And so part of what we're hoping to do is to capture a lot of the stories that are out there. What are the lessons learned? What types of strategies and activities are you doing? And what are the key messages and recommendations you might have? And use that to build into the sea level rise vulnerability and adaptation report. And so I'd like to share with you a couple stories, just very briefly, to show you where this is going. So the Kauai County story, where Kauai is now, for the first time, incorporating sea level rise and climate change in their general plan update. One of the key messages that came out of this story was that we do have existing planning frameworks. We just need to integrate this work into them. And I like the quote from the planning director, Michael Dahilig: planning has to integrate science. So down the road, these are the kinds of things that we'll be looking at. And the next two stories, I'd like to recognize our collaborator, Anu Hittel, who you'll hear from in a few minutes. She's helping to build this storybook with us. And this is the Kaena Point Natural Area Reserve story, where they are really recognizing that we might have climate migrants in the form of seabirds, sea turtles, monk seals that typically live in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands and now are might be looking for new homes. So how do we expand refugia in the main Hawaiian Islands? They would like to do more work with the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument to look at coordinated conservation. And of course, education and outreach will be important because there will be conflicts, and we have already started to see some of those conflicts when we have monk seals coming in and people kind of clashing in territories. The last story I just quickly want to share was from Bellows Air Force Station. They've really recognized how important managing the sand dunes are for preserving the recreational and cultural significance of their area and then engaging communities in this work. So these are just a few stories, and I know there are so many out there. And I would like to ask you, we have at the registration desk a little simple form and template. If you would like to share a story, please go and get that form, or if we run out, you can email Allie. Her information will be up there, and share her stories. And we can start building this larger base of information. So now I'd like to shift to the second track of our approach. So the first being the education and outreach and some examples, and now this one, which is more the risk assessment and how do we project those risks from sea level rise. And so I just want to show you that the risk assessment, that orange in the center here, is really built on two key inputs. One are the projections of future coastal hazards. We've seen what those are from Dr. Fletcher's work and the sea level rise projections that we'll be looking at for the different years. And on the right side are the community data, which we are amassing from the counties, the states, and any other sources that will help provide us with a good database of what are all the environmental, social, and economic assets that might be impacted, might be vulnerable to these various hazards. And we will be using HAZIS, which is a model software program, open access, open source, that's developed and maintained by FEMA as a primary tool with geospatial analysis to look at the vulnerability and to quantify losses. So let me just show you some of the very interim outputs of such a modeling effort, and then for starting with the 100-year coastal floodplain. So on the left, FEMA develops flood insurance rate maps, and this red area shows the 1% annual risk of flooding. So if you look at, this is Eva Beach, and we're using the same pilot that Dr. Fletcher showed. If you look at that, it's hard to see, but there's just very small amount of properties just at the very edge of that flood zone. And you can see Fort Reaver Road is that white dash line. So what this says is if you have a home in that floodplain and you have a federally backed mortgage, you must have flood insurance. And so this is a regulatory tool that FEMA uses. And if you haven't been to our state's flood hazard assessment tool, you can put in your address and see where you are in relation to this zone. So then we've taken this, and these maps are updated. In fact, this one is based on the flood insurance study that was, I think, updated in 2014, and that information is all there and how they did the modeling and so forth. And we took that and we just applied the future sea level rise of 3.2 feet, and you can see how much more flooding occurs. So it covers the road, it covers many more houses. So now we take this basic footprint and we look at how does it affect the assets that fall under that? How does it affect the homes, the properties, the roads, and so forth? Now this is just one sample output of a risk index. It shows you dark areas, which have a higher number, a higher potential risk, and lighter areas that are a lower risk. The index ranges from 0 to 1, and it's shown at the census block level. So while our analysis actually goes property by property, building by building, we are rolling that information up and presenting it as a way of communicating risk at a census block level. This index happens to be a composite of variables: social variables, economic variables, and environmental. We can cut it, we can separate them out in any different format and way we want, but just to show you kind of this composite risk index. You can also pull out any one of these variables and look at displaced population from that projection. So here we have different pie charts that show you displaced population by age group, by racial identity, and by income group. So again, this is just Eva Beach, and this is just a sample of what the types of information that we can provide to help make decisions and think about what kind of recommendations we need to put forth. Now I'd like to give you one other example, and this is for coastal erosion. Dr. Fletcher already showed this, the 80% erosion line. So what kind of assets are in its way? What will happen? This is another type of output. So this shows loss density. What we can do is we can calculate, because we have detailed tax information for all the properties, for all the land values, and other types of infrastructure, we can actually calculate the dollars per square foot that is lost by census block. And we did that just because it's a way of unitizing. We can say the total dollars divided by the area of the census block gives you this kind of range. So a dark color is a higher loss, light color is less. So just imagine that we will be generating these types of maps and outputs for the state. So we will be looking at them every island, and for all the different hazards that we identify, and for the different time frames to provide the richest sort of benchmark foundation to start thinking about these challenges ahead. One other one I want to show you is about just being able to roll up the total losses, land and building. Now for coastal erosion, remember that this is modeled as a total loss because we're losing land. The land is going away, so that land is valuable, and we're losing it. We're losing the structures. What struck me about this, and this is in loss in millions of dollars for 2030 to 2100 on the right. What struck me is that in just 15 years, we are getting a large fraction of that loss already, and you can see it persist into the next time frame, into 2050, which adds just a little bit. So this is just not too far beyond the horizon. Finally, I want to just give you an example of again, total losses for this one example, this one time frame, Aneva Beach, and think about in terms of how we can look across the different hazards. Some are more permanent losses, others are temporary. So when we talk about losses due to static and groundwater inundation, we're talking about these are areas that will be permanently inundated. When we talk about coastal erosion losses, these are areas that will go away. On the other hand, we might have seasonal run-up, which can be modeled as a more temporary loss. However, if we continue to have that type of that kind of flooding, it might not be so temporary. And again, the 100-year coastal floodplain is yet another sort of more temporary based on the way that probability is. So you can see the differences in the amount of loss, the number of structures, the amount of property, and gives you an idea of what we're up against. So now I would just like to focus that these are the preliminary, they give you a flavor of the types of outputs from the risk assessment. And again, I would just want to say, will this be the end-all of the assessment? No, because it's a living document. It's something that will need to be reviewed and updated as new science and modeling come out. And I know that there are many of you, some of you in the room probably are doing very detailed additional modeling, things that we'll need to know about and will provide more information to us in the future. But these can serve as a benchmark to frame our recommendations for adapting to sea level rise. And how will we frame those recommendations? So we are still working on that, but I'd like to just throw out some of the key elements that we're considering now. And these include adaptation strategies, tools, and governance. So there's generally four kinds of adaptation strategies that we typically find in the literature. These are protection, accommodation, planned retreat, and preservation. We're an island state. We may not be able to move our airport, so we may have to adopt strategy to protect certain types of structures and critical infrastructure with hardening with shoreline hardening or hardening structures, even though we know that probably has some adverse effects. We might be able to, in the medium term, accommodate some of the sea level rise through engineering design or retrofits. We ultimately probably want to start thinking about how do we discourage development in high-risk areas through overall planned retreat. And lastly, we talked about the Kaena Point story. How do we look at preservation of natural resource and habitat values to help us, whether it be dune management or coral reef management to protect us from waves and coastal erosion, or whether it be allowing for climate migrants from low-lying islets in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So the next category of framing the recommendations might be in looking at various tools, because the strategies alone will provide kind of the guidance or steer the course, but we'll need a lot of tools. And again, there's about 4 categories of tools we might think of. There are planning tools, like our hazard mitigation plans, and the state has already started to integrate climate change into that plan. General plans, we heard from Kauai and others. There's also regulations. There are a couple of bills in this year's state legislature that are starting to identify, do we need property disclosures that will help us, like a termite inspection, to say, well, these are certain hazards that this property will have. And an environmental review. How do we consider climate change and sea level rise in that? There are spending tools. When we have to shell out a large amount of money for infrastructure, planning new infrastructure or new developments, how do we make sure that these programs are considering sea level rise? And then there are incentives. The community rating system is one interesting one that I know Maui and the Big Island are part of FEMA's community rating system. This gives you, if you put in place certain practices and provisions, this will help reduce your insurance premiums. So we should look at, some of these types of programs. Finally, we need to think about governance. What are the, how do we work in the future? Is there something different we need to do? How do we ignite innovation? Do we need to, build a stronger stakeholder empowerment through various outreach and engagement activities? How do we make the collaboration that we all do, kind of more effective? I mean, how do we really break down some of the silos that we might need to do to work together? And finally, we probably need to have a more adaptive approach in how we, not only to address uncertainties that may come and in the science and the projections, but maybe also on how effective our plans and our actions are, so that we can test small things and see if those are really going to work the way we think they're going to work, and monitor and evaluate those. And we can do a lot of that testing now. So anyway, finally, I just will end with, what will our sea level rise report look like? As Dr. Fletcher showed us the sea level rise sampler. Well, these are kind of the draft sections, as it were. We want to project an image of a vision for the future that articulates the cost of inaction, as well as a call to action. We want to have a clear statement about what are the risks, what are the projected changes, global and local, of sea level rise. We will have a section that pulls together and communicates the potential risks to Hawaii's communities, infrastructure, resources, environment, as much as information as we can provide. And then we'll have some overview of the kinds of recommendations, both in terms of strategies and tools that are needed, but also in recommended institutional arrangements and governance. And finally, for those who want to go deeper, dive deeper, the last part will be really the methodologies, the assumptions, and the detailed results, so we can document carefully what all those are, so that when we go back to review this and update that there is no question what the basis of this report is, so that we can build on it in the future. Thank you.